Some stories find us when we need them most. This is a story about darkness, not the kind that comes when the sun goes down, but the kind that settles into bones and stays there. It's about a dog who spent 3 years in a place no living thing should ever know. And it's about an old man whose hands shake too much to hold a coffee cup steady anymore, but who still had enough left in him to reach out when it mattered. I wrote this for those of you who understand what it means to sit in an empty house and wonder if anyone remembers you're still here. For those who've lost someone and found the silence afterward almost unbearable. For those who believe, as I do, that sometimes the most broken among us have the most love left to give. This is their story. I hope it finds you well. The cage door swung open. Light poured in harsh, white, foreign. The German Shepherd didn't move. 4 legs trembled beneath a body that was more bone than flesh, ribs pressed against matted fur like fingers pushing through a thin blanket. Eyes squeezed shut. Not from fear, from something deeper. 3 years in darkness. 3 years of nothing but the flicker of a dying fluorescent bulb overhead. This light, real light. Sunlight filtering through a warehouse door somewhere behind the rescue workers was a language the dog had never learned to speak. Around him, chaos, the crackle of police radios, the scrape of metal cages being dragged across concrete. Somewhere to the left, a young woman in a blue vest sobbed into her hands. Other dogs whimpered and howled from their crates, finally tasting fresh air for the first time in years. But this dog made no sound. His throat had forgotten how. A hand appeared at the edge of the cage. Latex glove, a slow movement. The dog flinched backward, spine colliding with the rusted bars behind him. His whole body contracted, shrinking, as if he could fold himself small enough to disappear. Easy there. Easy. The voice was different. No sharpness, no anger, no promise of pain waiting at the end of it. Just 2 words, spoken low, like a man talking to himself in an empty room. The dog's ears, the right one torn, a chunk missing from some old wound that never healed right, twitched. Rotated. Listening. I know. The voice continued. Closer now. The man had entered the cage, boots scraping against the wet concrete floor. He didn't reach out, didn't crowd, just lowered himself down, grunting as old knees protested, and sat, 1 meter away, no more. The smell hit him first. Urine. Feces. Old blood. Dried and flaking. The copper-rot stench of wounds left untreated for too long. David had been a veterinarian for 42 years. He knew this smell. Had encountered it in barns and backyard sheds and once, memorably, in the trunk of a car abandoned behind the Walmart on Route 9. But this was worse. This was concentrated. Years of suffering compressed into a space no bigger than a bathroom stall. David didn't speak again. He just sat there, hands resting on his thighs, hands that trembled, that wouldn't stop trembling no matter how hard he willed them still, and waited. 5 minutes passed. 10. The dog didn't move, but something shifted in its breathing. The ragged panting slowed, the rigid muscles along its back loosened. Just slightly. 15 minutes. David's friend Frank stood outside the cage, arms crossed, face gray. He'd been sheriff of Maplewood for 30 years before retiring, seen things that kept him up at night. But even he couldn't look at this dog for too long. "David," he said quietly, "we need to move him. Transport's waiting." David didn't turn around. "Give me another minute." The team, "1 more minute, Frank." Silence. David looked at the dog. The dog looked at nothing at some point beyond the cage. Beyond the warehouse, beyond anything David could see. That 1,000-yard stare. David had seen it before. On the faces of soldiers coming home from places they couldn't talk about. On Margaret's face, those last few days, when she stopped looking at him and started looking somewhere else entirely. "I know," David said again, his voice barely a whisper. "I know what it's like. Sitting in the dark, waiting for something that ain't coming." The dog's head turned, slow, joints cracking with disuse, neck muscles that hadn't moved in months remembering, painfully, how to function, and for the first time. The dog looked at David, not through him, at him. Two dark eyes, clouded with malnutrition and neglect, but still alive, still holding something that hadn't quite been extinguished. David's chest tightened. "Well," he breathed, "there you are. If this story has touched something in you, I'd love to know where you're reading from today. Drop a comment below, as my grandmother used to say. Shared joy is double joy." The coffee maker gurgled in the kitchen. 5:14 in the morning. Same time as yesterday. Same time as the day before that. Same time as every day since Margaret stopped being the one to turn it on. David stood at the counter, both hands wrapped around the Folgers canister. The tremor started in his right hand, always the right hand first, and spread up through his wrist, his forearm, until the red plastic lid rattled against the metal rim. He set the canister down, waited, pressed his palms flat against the cold countertop until the shaking subsided to something manageable. Parkinson's. Early stage. The neurologist in Columbus had used words like progressive and degenerative and quality of life considerations. David had nodded at all the right places. Driven home and told no one. That was 8 months ago. The kitchen smelled like it always did coffee grounds, the faint mustiness of a house that didn't get opened up enough. And underneath it all, something floral. Margaret's hand lotion, lilac and vanilla. She kept a bottle by the sink for 30 years. He couldn't bring himself to throw it away. Through the window over the sink, the sky was turning gray at the edges, dawn coming. Another day. David poured his coffee 2 hands. Always 2 hands now, and carried it to the front porch. The screen door creaked. The wooden boards groaned under his weight. 2 rocking chairs sat side by side. Facing the road, the one on the left had a thin layer of dust across the armrests. He didn't look at it. The Zenith radio on the porch railing crackled to life when he turned the dial. Country station out of Cincinnati. Patsy Cline singing about falling to pieces. Margaret used to hum along to this one while she weeded the garden. Off-key. Never cared who heard. David lowered himself into his chair. The coffee warmed his hands. The tremor made small ripples across the surface. Tiny waves that never quite settled. On the mantel inside, behind the screen door, the wedding photo from 1978 caught the first weak light of morning. Margaret in white. Him with dark hair and steady hands and no idea what 47 years would bring. Somewhere down the road, the Methodist church bells began their Sunday morning call. David didn't move. The phone rang. Frank never called before 6. The Ford F-150 bounced over potholes on County Road 7. David gripped the steering wheel with both hands, the only way to keep it steady anymore, and watched the cornfields blur past in the early morning light. 7 miles outside Maplewood. Frank had given him directions twice, but David knew this road, knew the old Hendricks farm at the end of it. Abandoned since Carl Hendricks passed in 09 and his kids sold off the equipment and never looked back. He smelled it before he saw it. The odor rolled through the truck's vents like something alive. Ammonia, rot, the copper-sweet undertone of old blood. David's stomach turned. 42 years of veterinary practice, and some smells still hit him like a fist. Red and blue lights flickered through the dead corn stalks ahead. 3 county cruisers, an animal control van, a white truck with Ohio Humane Society stenciled on the side, yellow crime scene tape stretched between fence posts. David pulled onto the shoulder and killed the engine. His hands wouldn't stop shaking as he reached for the door handle. Frank met him at the tape line. The former sheriff looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. Deep lines carved around his mouth, eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "Thanks for coming." Frank's voice was gravel. "I know you're retired, but..." "How bad?" Frank didn't answer. He just lifted the tape and gestured toward the barn. The main doors hung open, inside. The darkness was thick, almost solid. David's eyes adjusted slowly. Shapes emerged from the shadows. Metal crates stacked 3 high along both walls. Concrete floor stained dark in patches, no windows. A single fluorescent tube flickered overhead, buzzing like a dying insect. 16 cages, most empty now, their occupants already loaded into the rescue vehicles outside. A young woman in a blue volunteer vest sat on an overturned bucket near the entrance. Face buried in her hands. Her shoulders shook. No sound came out. "We found them at 3 this morning," Frank said, walking David deeper into the barn. "Anonymous tip to the station. Payphone at the Sunoco on Route 40. The smell intensified with each step. Urine, feces, something else underneath the sour reek of infected wounds, of flesh that had started to break down while still attached to living bone. David breathed through his mouth. It didn't help much. Owner's name is Victor Hale. We've had our eye on him for years, but never enough to get a warrant." Frank stopped walking. "He cleared out before we got here, left everything behind, including them." David looked at the empty cages, bent bars, scratch marks gouged into the metal, clumps of fur caught in the wire mesh. 16 dogs, Frank continued. German shepherds, mostly pit mixes, 1 Rottweiler. He paused. 13 are in rough shape, 2 didn't make it, and 1... He pointed toward the far corner of the barn, the darkest corner. A single cage sat apart from the others, low to the ground, pushed against the wall like an afterthought. "That one won't let anyone near. Doesn't growl. Doesn't snap. Just sits there, like it's already gone." David walked toward the cage. His boots squelched against the wet concrete. The fluorescent light didn't reach this far, just a gray dimness that swallowed details and left only outlines. He crouched down, knees popped, lower back protested. Inside the cage, a shape, curled tight against the back corner. Fur so matted and filthy it was impossible to tell the original color. Ribs like a xylophone under stretched skin. 1 ear torn, a chunk missing from the top. The dog's eyes were open, staring at nothing. David had seen that stare before. On soldiers at the VA hospital where Margaret used to volunteer. On Margaret herself. Those last terrible days when she stopped seeing him and started seeing somewhere else. He reached for the cage latch. "David?" Frank's voice was sharp. "We don't know what that dog's been trained to do. Could be dangerous." The latch clicked open. David crawled inside. The ceiling of the cage pressed against his back. The concrete was cold and wet through his jeans. The smell was overwhelming years of suffering packed into a space barely big enough to turn around in. He sat down, 1 meter from the dog. No closer. The German shepherd didn't move, didn't react, just kept staring at that invisible point somewhere beyond the walls. David's hands trembled in his lap. He pressed them against his thighs, but the shaking wouldn't stop. I know, he said quietly. The words came out before he'd decided to speak them. I know what it's like. Sitting in the dark, waiting for something that ain't coming. The dog's ear twitched, the torn one. Just a tiny movement, a rotation toward the sound of his voice. David waited. The minutes stretched. His back ached. His knees screamed. He didn't move. The dog's head turned. Slow, painful, neck muscles remembering how to work after months of stillness. And then the dog looked at him, not through him, at him. Something flickered in those dark eyes, something that hadn't quite gone out. Well, I'll be, David whispered. He turned to Frank, still standing at the barn entrance, arms crossed, face unreadable. I'm taking this one home. Frank opened his mouth to argue, then he looked at David, the trembling hands, the wet eyes, the set of his jaw, and said nothing. Outside, tires crunched on gravel. A door slammed. Voices rose near the rescue vehicles. Frank's radio crackled. A deputy's voice. Tinny and urgent. Sheriff, we got a situation. Reporter from the Gazette just pulled up. They're asking questions about the dogs. The dog wouldn't come out from behind the sofa. 3 days now. David had pushed the old leather couch 6 inches from the wall, just enough space for the German shepherd to wedge himself into the darkest corner of the living room. The dog hadn't moved since David carried him inside, wrapped in a blanket that still sat crumpled on the kitchen floor. Food bowl, 2 meters away. Kibble mixed with canned chicken. The expensive kind from the pet store in Columbus. Every morning. David checked. Every morning, untouched. Water bowl beside it, the level dropped slightly each night. The dog drank when no one was watching. Take your time, David said. Lowering himself onto the sofa, his knees cracked, his back protested. Ain't nobody rushing you. He reached for the radio on the side table, the old Zenith. Same one Margaret used to keep in the kitchen, and turned the dial until a familiar voice filled the room. Hank Williams. I'm so lonesome I could cry. The volume low, just above a whisper, behind the sofa. Silence. But no scrambling, no panicked breathing. David leaned back and closed his eyes. The second week, he tried the curtains. Morning light spilled across the hardwood floor when he pulled the cord. Dust motes swirled in the golden beams. Outside, a robin called from the maple tree. Behind the sofa, a whimper, claws scraping wood. The sound of a body pressing itself deeper into shadow. David closed the curtains. The next day, he opened them for 5 minutes. The day after, 7. Each morning. A little longer. The dog's whimpering grew softer. The frantic scrambling slowed. By day 10, the German shepherd stayed still when the light came in, eyes squeezed shut, body trembling. But still, progress measured in minutes, in silence, in the absence of panic. Night 12. David stood at the kitchen sink, hands submerged in warm dishwater. The ceramic bowl was slippery with soap. His fingers tightened around it, or tried to. The tremor hit without warning, a violent shake that traveled from his wrist to his elbow. The bowl slipped, crashed against the porcelain sink, shattered. Pieces scattered across the counter, the floor, the front of his shirt, from the living room scrambling. Claws on hardwood, the high-pitched panting of an animal reliving something terrible. David gripped the edge of the sink, breathed, waited for his hands to steady. They didn't. He crouched to pick up the pieces. His right hand shook so badly that a shard of ceramic sliced across his thumb. Blood welled up bright red against the white porcelain scattered on the yellow linoleum. He sat down on the kitchen floor. The cold seeped through his jeans. Broken pieces surrounded him like the aftermath of something much larger than a dropped bowl. Blood dripped from his thumb onto the linoleum. He didn't reach for a towel. These hands that had stitched wounds closed, set broken bones, delivered breech puppies at 3 in the morning. These hands that had held Margaret's face the day he proposed, that had gripped hers in the hospital bed at the end. Now they couldn't hold a dish. David pressed his palms against his thighs. The tremor continued, relentless. He stared at the blood on his thumb and felt something crack open inside his chest. "Lord, help me," he whispered to the empty kitchen. A sound. Soft. Close. He looked up. The dog stood in the kitchen doorway. First time in 12 days it had left the space behind the sofa, ribs still visible under the fur that had started to lose its matted clumps, legs thin, unsteady, head low, ears flat. But it was there, looking at him. David didn't move, didn't speak. The dog looked at the broken pieces on the floor, at the blood on David's hand, at David's face. It didn't come closer, just stood there, watching, breath shallow but steady. Two broken things, studying each other across the kitchen floor. "Yeah," David said, his voice rough. "I reckon we're quite a pair, ain't we?" The dog's tail moved, just once, a single, uncertain twitch. Then it turned and walked back to the living room. Not running, walking. David stayed on the floor for a long time after that. 3 in the morning. Week 3. David's eyes snapped open. The bedroom was dark, the only light a thin strip of moonlight through the gap in the curtains. His heart hammered against his ribs. Sweat soaked the collar of his t-shirt. The dream again. Margaret in the hospital bed, tubes and wires, the steady beep of machines, her eyes finding his one last time. Then the long flat tone that meant everything was over. He lay still, staring at the ceiling, waiting for his pulse to slow. A sound. Soft breathing. Close. David turned his head. The dog lay on the floor beside the bed, one hand's width away from the mattress, eyes open, watching him in the darkness. It had climbed the stairs. First time since David brought it home. Neither of them moved. David listened to the dog breathe. The dog listened to David breathe. Outside, an owl called from somewhere in the maple tree. The old house settled and creaked, the way it always did in the small hours. David's eyes grew heavy. The dog's presence warm. Alive. They're pressed against the edges of his awareness like a hand on his shoulder. He slept. No dreams this time. Morning light through the curtains. David reached for the phone on the nightstand. Frank picked up on the second ring. "How's the patient?" "His name is Shadow." Silence, then a low chuckle. "Shadow, he following you around now." David looked toward the window. The dog stood in the beam of sunlight that fell across the bedroom floor, trembling, squinting, but not hiding. "No," David said, "because he's learning to step out of the dark." More silence. "David." "So am I." "Frank." "So am I." He hung up before Frank could respond. The sound of tires on gravel. David crossed to the window, looked out. A blue Buick pulled up to the curb. Eleanor's car. She lived 3 houses down, had lived there for 30 years, since before David and Margaret moved to Maple Street. Eleanor stepped out, smoothing her cardigan, her eyes already fixed on David's front window. The expression on her face was one David had seen too many times lately. Worry, and something else underneath it. Fear. David sighed, pushed himself up from the chair. "Lord, give me strength." He walked toward the front door. Behind him, Shadow pressed himself flat against the wall, watching. Eleanor stood at the gate. Not inside it. At it. Her fingers wrapped around the iron bars like she was visiting someone in prison. David. She clutched her purse against her chest, a shield. I heard you brought home one of those dogs. News travels fast. This is Maplewood. News travels faster than a brush fire in July. Her eyes shifted past David's shoulder, scanning the windows of the house. Where is it? Inside, he doesn't go out much yet. Eleanor's lips pressed thin. David, you know I care about you. You know I thought the world of Margaret, but people are talking. They're saying those dogs were trained to... She stopped. Swallowed. To fight. To hurt people. David stepped onto the porch. The screen door banged shut behind him. You want to see him? Eleanor took a half step back. Her hand moved to her left forearm, an unconscious gesture. David knew what was under her cardigan sleeve. He'd treated the wound himself, back in '87 when the Hendersons' Rottweiler had gotten loose. 12 stitches, the scar still puckered white against her skin. I'm not asking you to pet him, Ellie. Just look. She didn't move. David walked down the porch steps, crossed the lawn, and stopped at the gate, close enough to see the fine lines around Eleanor's eyes, the slight tremble in her hands. He's more scared of you than you are of him. I promise you that. Eleanor's jaw tightened, but she let David open the gate, let him lead her up the steps to the porch, let him position her in front of the living room window. Inside, shadow lay pressed against the far wall. When he saw the unfamiliar shape at the window, his whole body contracted, legs pulled tight against his belly, head ducked low. He made himself as small as possible, a dog trying to disappear into the wallpaper. Lord have mercy, Eleanor whispered. That's what 3 years in darkness does. David's voice was steady. He's not dangerous, Ellie. He's terrified. There's a difference. Eleanor stared at the trembling shape behind the glass. Her hand dropped from her forearm. You're a stubborn old fool. David, I reckon I am. Margaret always said so. I reckon she did. Eleanor sighed a long, slow exhale that seemed to drain something out of her. I won't sign any petition against you, but I won't stand up for you either. Not yet. You understand? David nodded. All I'm asking is you give him a chance. Give us both a chance. Eleanor didn't answer. She turned, walked down the porch steps, paused at the gate. You're too thin, she said without looking back. You look like a scarecrow in a windstorm. I'll bring over some of my chicken casserole tomorrow. And don't you dare say no. Then she was gone, the blue Buick pulling away from the curb, and David was alone again with a dog who was watching him through the window with something that might have been curiosity. Month 2, Shadow ate when David was in the room now, not looking at him, always facing the corner, body curved away but eating. The click of kibble against ceramic, the soft lap of water, small sounds that filled the silence of the house. Afternoons. David sat on the back porch. The roof overhang kept the light soft, filtered. Shadow would follow him out hesitant, belly low to the ground, and settle beneath David's chair, nose pointed toward the yard, ears rotating, catching every sound. Nothing out there gonna hurt you, David said, not looking down. Just squirrels and robins, maybe a rabbit or two if we're lucky. The dog's breathing slowed. The rigid muscles along his spine loosened. Progress measured in exhales. Month 3. Tuesday morning. David stood at the kitchen counter, measuring coffee grounds into the filter. The Folgers can was nearly empty. He'd need to drive to town soon. The thought exhausted him. Everything exhausted him lately. A sound from the doorway, hoarse, short, like someone coughing through a mouthful of gravel. David turned. Shadow stood at the threshold, mouth open, throat working. Another sound came out rough, broken. barely recognizable as what it was trying to be. A bark, or the memory of one. A voice that had forgotten itself trying to remember. David set down the coffee can. His hands were shaking. They never stopped shaking anymore, but he didn't notice. "That's it, boy." His own voice came out thick. "That's it? Let it out." Shadow barked again, a strangled, painful sound. Then silence, as if the effort had frightened him. But his tail moved, one small wag, tentative, uncertain. David sat down hard in the kitchen chair. His shoulders shook. His vision blurred. Shadow stood in the doorway, watching the old man cry, and didn't run away. Month 4, October. The leaves on the maple tree in the front yard had turned gold and copper. David was raking slowly, one-handed. The other pressed against his lower back when he noticed the figure at the fence. A boy, 12, maybe 13. Skinny as a fence post, blonde hair that needed cutting, hanging over his forehead in greasy strands, gray hoodie 3 sizes too big, sleeves pulled down over his hands. He wasn't looking at David. He was looking at the porch, where Shadow lay in the afternoon shade. "Help you with something?" The boy flinched. His eyes darted to David, then back to the dog. "That dog." His voice was thin, reedy. "What do you call him? Shadow." The boy's throat moved. His hands gripped the fence so tight his knuckles went white. "Before," he said. "Before you." What was his name before? David set down the rake. Crossed the lawn, up close. The boy looked even younger, dark circles under his eyes. A fading bruise on his cheekbone, mostly hidden by the hair. "He didn't have a name before, just a number." The boy nodded. His lower lip trembled, then steadied. "Number 7, he said. "That's what the man called him. Number 7. David's chest went cold. "You know him. You know this dog." The boy's eyes filled. He blinked rapidly, jaw clenched, fighting it. "My dad works nights at the meat plant. 3, 4 times a week. Those nights, He stopped, started again. "I couldn't sleep. I'd go walking. One night I heard dogs, crying, coming from the old Hendricks place." David didn't move, didn't breathe. "I found a hole in the fence, crawled through, saw the cages." The boy's voice cracked. "I couldn't do nothing. I was too scared. But I started bringing food, scraps from home. Every time my dad worked nights, I'd go back, push it through the gaps in the wire. How long? Up to almost 2 years. Until I—" The boy wiped his nose with his sleeve. "I called the cops. From the payphone at the Sunoco. I didn't tell my dad. He'd tan my hide if he knew I was sneaking out." David opened the gate. "Come inside, son." The boy, Nathan, David learned later, stepped into the yard. Shadow raised his head from the porch, his body tensed. Then, slowly, he stood, walked down the steps, crossed the lawn toward the boy with the too big hoodie and the shaking hands. Nathan dropped to his knees in the grass. Shadow approached, cautious, nose working. He sniffed the boy's outstretched hand. His tail wagged, strong, certain, more than David had ever seen. "Hey, number 7, Nathan whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Hey, boy. You remember me, don't you?" Shadow pressed his head against Nathan's chest. The boy wrapped his arms around the dog's neck and buried his face in the coarse fur, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. David stood at the gate, watching the boy and the dog hold each other, and felt something shift in his chest. something that had been locked tight for 18 months. Inside, David made hot chocolate, the real kind milk heated on the stove. Cocoa powder and sugar stirred in by hand. Margaret's recipe, the kitchen filled with the smell of chocolate and warmth. And for a moment, David could almost hear her humming at the counter. Nathan sat on the floor, Shadow's head in his lap, and told him everything. About Victor Hale, about the cages stacked 3 high, about the sounds at night fighting, screaming, things Nathan still heard when he closed his eyes. About number 7, who never fought for food, who always waited, who once threw himself between Hale's boot and a smaller dog who couldn't stand anymore. That's why he has so many scars, Nathan said, stroking Shadow's ear. He protected the weak ones, took the beatings for them. The kitchen was quiet. The clock on the wall ticked. Shadow's breathing was slow and steady, his eyes half closed in something like peace. "Does your father know you're here?" Nathan stiffened. "No, sir. You should tell him. What you did calling the police, coming here today, that took real courage. He ought to know. I can't." The boy's voice went flat. "He'd be so mad. About the sneaking out. About all of it. He wouldn't understand." David looked at the boy, at the fading bruise, at the way he hunched his shoulders, making himself smaller. "Nathan, you did a brave thing. Braver than most grown men I know. Don't let anyone tell you different." Nathan didn't answer. His hand moved mechanically over Shadow's fur, finding comfort in the repetition. David carried the mugs of hot chocolate to the living room, 2 hands. Always 2 hands now, and set one on the floor beside Nathan. The boy wrapped his fingers around it, let the warmth seep into his palms. "This is real good," Nathan said quietly. "My mama used to make it like this, before she left." David lowered himself into his chair. His bones ached, his hands trembled. But something in his chest felt lighter than it had in months. "You're welcome here any time, son. You and Shadow, I reckon you've got some catching up to do." For the first time. Nathan smiled, small, fragile, but real. Outside, the sound of a car engine, tires on gravel, a door slamming. Nathan's head snapped up. His face went pale. "That's my dad's truck." Nathan's father filled the doorway, broad shoulders, thick arms crossed over a stained work jacket. The smell of the meat plant clung to him, blood and cold storage and industrial disinfectant. His eyes found Nathan on the floor, then moved to Shadow, then to David. "Get in the truck." Nathan stood. His legs shook. Shadow pressed against the boy's calf, a low whine building in his throat. "Dad, I can explain. Truck. Now." The man didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. Nathan walked past David without looking at him. Shoulders hunched, head down. The screen door banged shut behind him. Nathan's father stayed in the doorway. His jaw worked, grinding teeth. "You the one with the dog?" "I'm David. I know who you are. Everybody knows." The man's eyes were red-rimmed, bloodshot. Night shift exhaustion layered over something older, deeper. "My boy won't be coming back here. You understand he's caused enough trouble already. He was brave. What he did was sneak out of my house for 2 years. The words came out flat, hard. Made me look like a fool in front of the whole town. Father who can't keep track of his own kid." He spat on the porch boards. "We're done here." He turned and walked away. The pickup's engine roared to life. Gravel sprayed as it pulled out. And then the street was empty. And David stood alone with the dog who was shaking against his leg. The phone rang at 7 the next morning. David set down his coffee, 2 hands. Always 2 hands now, and crossed to the kitchen. Sit down. Frank's voice was tight. You sitting, and I'm standing. Then sit. David pulled out a chair, lowered himself into it. Shadow watched from the doorway, ears flat. Victor Hale got picked up in Kentucky last week. Crossing into Tennessee, he's got himself a lawyer now. Filing papers. Papers for what? Property reclamation. Frank paused. He wants the dogs back. David. All of them. Says they were seized without a proper warrant. His attorney's claiming the whole raid was unconstitutional. The kitchen went cold. David's hand tightened on the phone receiver until his knuckles ached. That's crazy talk. He tortured them. I know what he did, but the criminal case is still pending. No conviction yet. Legally, on paper, those dogs still belong to him. They're not property. I know. Frank's voice softened. There's more. Haley's lawyer has a witness, one of the fellows who worked for him. He's ready to testify that Shadow was the most aggressive dog in the operation. Says he attacked handlers multiple times. David looked at Shadow. The dog had pressed himself flat against the kitchen wall. Body trembling. Eyes fixed on David's face. Look at him. Frank, does that look like a vicious animal to you? What I see doesn't matter. What the court sees, that's what matters. Papers rustled on the other end of the line. Hearings set for 30 days out. You need a lawyer. David. I'll handle it myself. David. I said I'll handle it. He hung up before Frank could say anything else. The Maplewood Gazette hit doorsteps on Thursday morning. David found his copy in the mailbox. The carrier didn't come up the driveway anymore. The headline sat above the fold, black letters an inch high. Fighting dog in residential neighborhood. Residents express concern. He read it standing in the driveway. The article quoted anonymous sources describing Shadow as potentially dangerous. It mentioned David by name. It included a photograph of the old Hendricks barn. Crime scene tape stretched across the doors like a yellow scar. The coffee in David's stomach turned to acid. By noon, Eleanor's blue Buick was parked at the curb again. This time, she wasn't alone. 7 people stood on the sidewalk in front of David's house. He recognized them all. Tom Miller, whose beagle David had saved from Parvo back in 2015. Ruth Patterson from the Methodist Church Choir. The Peterson family from 2 doors down. Their 3-year-old balanced on his father's hip. Eleanor led them up the walk. In her hands a clipboard. David met them on the porch. David, Eleanor's voice was strained. We need to talk. I can see that. This isn't personal. You know it isn't. She held out the clipboard. We have children in this neighborhood. The Petersons' little boy plays in that front yard every single day. If that dog got loose, he doesn't go outside. But if he did... Tom Miller stepped forward. Thick arms, kind face, the face of a man doing something that made him uncomfortable. We're not saying you're a bad person, David, but we've all read about those dogs, what they were trained to do. We can't take that kind of risk. David looked at the clipboard, a typed letter, formal language, requesting immediate review of the dangerous animal situation at 47 Maple Street. Below it, signatures. He counted them without meaning to, 23 names. People he'd known for decades. People whose pets he'd treated, whose hands he'd shaken at Margaret's funeral, who'd brought casseroles and condolences in those first terrible weeks. 23 signatures asking for his dog to be taken away. I've been a vet in this town for 42 years. David's voice was steady, though his hands were not. I've never put an animal at risk. I've never put a person at risk. You all know that. Silence. We know. David. Ruth Patterson spoke up, her voice gentle as a hymn. But this is different. This dog, it comes from a bad place. Some things just can't be fixed. Watch me. He took the clipboard from Eleanor's hands, looked at each signature in turn, then handed it back. "You do what you have to do. I'll do what I have to do." Eleanor's jaw tightened. She turned, walked down the steps, the others following like a flock of uncertain sheep. At the gate, she looked back. "I hope you know what you're doing. David, for your sake, I truly do." Then they were gone, and David was alone on the porch with a petition full of familiar names and a dog pressed tight against his ankle. Trembling. The court summons arrived 2 weeks later. David sat at the kitchen table, the envelope open in front of him, official county letterhead, dense legal language. His hands trembled so badly he could barely make out the words. Hearing scheduled. 30 days. Shadow to remain confined indoors, pending determination of custody and public safety assessment. Custody. Like the dog was a child caught between warring parents. David set the paper down, pressed his palms flat against the table until the shaking eased to something manageable. Shadow padded over from his spot by the wall. In the months since David had brought him home, the dog had changed, filled out. His coat had regained some of its shine, the ribs no longer pressed quite so starkly against the skin. But more than that, he sought David out now, followed him from room to room, pressed against his leg when he sat down, rested his head on David's knee while he read the evening paper. Small intimacies that cost the dog nothing and meant everything. Now Shadow pushed his head against David's thigh, his eyes dark, deep, holding something that hadn't been there 4 months ago, looked up. David reached down, ran his trembling fingers over the dog's ears, the torn one, the whole one, felt the warmth of living flesh beneath his palm. "They want to send you back," his voice cracked, "back to that monster, back to the dark." Shadow didn't understand the words, but he understood tone. He pressed closer, a soft whine building in his throat. David slid off the chair, knelt on the kitchen floor, knees screaming, back protesting, and wrapped his arms around the dog's neck. First time he'd ever held Shadow like this. The dog stiffened, then, slowly, relaxed into the embrace. "I won't let them." David's face pressed into the coarse fur. "You hear me. Boy, I promise I won't let them take you back." Shadow stood perfectly still. His heart beat against David's chest, steady, trusting, alive. Outside, the afternoon light was fading. Long shadows stretched across the kitchen floor. Reaching toward them like fingers, in 30 days, a judge would decide whether this dog, this broken, healing, impossibly brave dog would stay in the light or be dragged back into darkness. David didn't have a lawyer. Didn't have money for one. Didn't have anyone willing to stand beside him in a courtroom. All he had was a promise made to a dog who couldn't understand it, and 2 trembling hands that couldn't even hold a coffee cup steady. The house at the end of Miller Road looked smaller than David remembered, paint peeling off the siding in long strips, a rusted pickup in the driveway, weeds pushing through cracks in the concrete walkway. David knocked. The door opened. Nathan's father stood there in a stained undershirt, a can of beer sweating in his fist. His eyes narrowed. I need Nathan to testify. At the hearing, he's the only one who saw what happened inside that barn. He can tell the court that Shadow isn't dangerous. No. If you just let me explain, I said no." The man stepped forward, close enough that David could smell the alcohol on his breath, the stale sweat, the anger simmering beneath the surface. "My boy's not going to stand up in some courtroom and tell the whole county he was sneaking out at night for 2 years. You know what folks would say about me. What kind of father lets that happen under his own roof? This isn't about you. It's about, everything's about me when it's my kid." The man's lip curled. "Get off my property, old man." "Please. Nathan cares about that dog. He risked everything to— He's 12 years old. He doesn't know what he risked." The door started to swing shut. "Don't come back here." David's hand shot out. Catching the door frame, his fingers trembled against the wood. That boy did something brave, something most grown men wouldn't have the courage to do, and you're going to let it mean nothing because you're worried about what the neighbors might whisper. The door slammed. David jerked his hand back just in time to save his fingers. He stood on the cracked concrete, staring at the peeling paint. The rusted truck, the weeds reclaiming the walkway inch by inch. Rain started to fall, light at first, then heavier. David didn't move. Upstairs, in a window with a torn curtain, a pale face watched him. Nathan. The boy's hand pressed flat against the glass. His mouth moved, forming words David couldn't hear through the rain. "I'm sorry." David turned and walked back to his truck. The rain soaked through his jacket, his shirt, his skin. By the time he reached the driver's door, he was shivering so hard his teeth chattered. He sat behind the wheel for a long time, watching the water stream down the windshield before he could make his hand steady enough to turn the key. The night before the hearing, David couldn't sleep. He sat in the kitchen, staring at the papers spread across the table. Legal documents he didn't fully understand. Printouts about animal cruelty laws he'd found at the library. Notes he'd written to himself, reminders of what to say. How to say it that shook so badly in his hand they were barely readable. Shadow lay at his feet. The dog's head rested on David's shoe. Warm breath dampening the leather. Midnight. 1 o'clock. 2. David reached for the whiskey bottle on the counter. Margaret's voice echoed in his head. "You promised me you'd quit that stuff, but Margaret wasn't here anymore." And the silence was so loud he couldn't bear it. His hand shook. The bottleneck rattled against the rim of the glass. Whiskey splashed across the table, soaking the papers. His sleeve, pooling on the wood. He gave up, set the bottle down, let the tremor run its course. These hands, these useless, broken, betraying hands. 42 years. They'd served him. Now they couldn't pour a simple drink without making a mess. Couldn't button a shirt without fumbling for 5 minutes. Couldn't hold a pen steady enough to sign his own name in a straight line. David looked at the papers, at the puddle of whiskey spreading across the legal documents, at his shaking hands resting helplessly on the table. What was he doing? Who did he think he was? An old man with a disease that was eating him alive. No lawyer, no money, no one willing to stand beside him. Going up against Victor Hale's attorney, against a system that saw a dog as property and a promise as nothing at all. He put his head down on the table, the whiskey soaked into his sleeve. He didn't care. Shadow whined softly, pressed closer against David's leg. "I'm sorry, boy." The words came out muffled against his arm. "I tried. Lord knows I tried." The hearing room was smaller than David expected. Wood-paneled walls. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry insects. A judge's bench at the front. 2 tables facing it, one for the plaintiff, one for the defendant. Victor Hale's attorney sat at the left table. Pressed suit, silver cufflinks that caught the light. Hair slicked back with something expensive. He shuffled papers with manicured hands, not even glancing up when David walked in. David took his seat at the right table. Alone. The bailiff called the room to order. The judge, a woman in her 60s, gray hair pulled back tight, reading glasses perched on her nose, entered and sat. "This hearing will determine the custody of 16 canines seized from the property of Victor Hale on September 14th. We'll begin with the plaintiff's statement." Hale's attorney stood. Smooth, confident, every word measured and precise, like a man who'd never doubted himself a day in his life. Your Honor, my client's property was seized without proper warrant. The animals in question are registered under his name, with full documentation of purchase and ownership. We're requesting immediate return of all 16 animals, including the German Shepherd currently held by one David. He glanced at his notes with theatrical care, a retired veterinarian with no legal standing to possess said animal. The attorney continued. Case law, precedent, property rights. David tried to follow, but the words blurred together, and his hands wouldn't stop shaking on the table. The tremor was visible now. Anyone who looked could see it. Then came the witness. A man David didn't recognize. Heavy-set, tattoos crawling up his neck like vines. He took the stand and swore to tell the truth, and then he lied. That German Shepherd number 7, he was the worst of the bunch, mean as a snake. Bit 2 handlers who tried to work with him, drew blood both times. David's stomach turned to ice. And in your experience working with these animals, would you characterize number 7 as dangerous to the public? Absolutely. That dog would tear someone apart if it got the chance. David looked at the judge. She was writing something down. Her face revealed nothing. The plaintiff rests. Your Honor, the judge turned to David. You may present your case. David stood. His legs felt like water. The room tilted slightly, then steadied. He'd rehearsed what to say, had practiced in the kitchen, in front of the bathroom mirror, in the truck on the way here, but now, standing before the judge, before Hale's smirking attorney, before the witness who just perjured himself without blinking. The words scattered like startled birds. Your Honor, His voice cracked. He cleared his throat. The dog Shadow, he's not dangerous. He's been living with me for 4 months. He's never shown any aggression. Do you have documentation of this behavioral assessment's veterinary evaluations? I was a vet for 42 years. I know animals. I know retired, according to these documents. The attorney's voice cut in, smooth as oil on water. And currently suffering from a progressive neurological condition that affects motor function and, potentially, judgment. Heat flooded David's face. His hands tremored violently against the table's edge, visible to everyone in the room. That has nothing to do with, Your Honor, I submit that this man is simply not a reliable caretaker for any animal, let alone one with a documented history of violence. There is no documented history. David's voice rose, cracked again. That man is lying. The dog never hurt anyone. He protected the other dogs. There's a boy who can testify. Where is this witness? David's mouth opened, closed. He couldn't. His father wouldn't allow. The attorney smiled. A thin, satisfied smile that made David want to put his fist through the man's teeth. So, no witness, no documentation, no legal standing. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, I move for immediate transfer of the animal to county holding, pending final resolution of ownership. The judge was silent for a long moment. She looked at David, at his shaking hands, his rumpled suit jacket, the dark circles under his eyes with an expression he recognized. Pity. Motion granted. The animal will be transferred to county animal control within 24 hours. The gavel came down. David stood frozen. The room emptied around him, the attorney gathering his expensive papers, the witness lumbering toward the exit, the bailiff holding the door with practiced indifference. 24 hours. He had 24 hours before they came to take Shadow away. And he had nothing left. No arguments, no allies, no dignity. His hands trembled against the empty table. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, somewhere in the building. A door slammed. Outside the courthouse, rain had begun to fall again. The house was dark when David got home. He didn't turn on the lights, just sat in the living room, in Margaret's old chair, and listened to Shadow breathe in the darkness beside him. 24 hours. Less now, maybe 18, 17. The clock on the mantel ticked. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen, outside. Rain tapped against the windows like fingers asking to be let in. David's hands lay still in his lap, too tired to shake anymore. "I'm sorry, boy." His voice was hoarse, worn thin. "I tried. I thought if I just told the truth, if I just—" He stopped. What was the point? The dog didn't understand words. And even if he did, what could David say? That trying wasn't enough, that the world didn't care about promises made in dark kitchens at 3 a.m. Shadow pressed closer against his leg. Warm, trusting. David closed his eyes. A knock at the door. David jerked awake. The room was still dark. The clock showed 9:47. He'd been asleep for hours. Another knock. Insistent. He pushed himself up from the chair. His back screamed. His knees popped like firecrackers. Shadow followed him to the door, pressed tight against his calf. David opened it. Eleanor stood on the porch. Rain dripped from her silver hair, her cardigan soaked through, her sensible shoes dark with mud. In her hands, a sheaf of papers. "Don't say a word." Her voice was sharp as a blade. "Just listen." David's mouth closed. "I watched you in that courtroom today, standing there alone, shaking like a leaf in a hurricane, trying to defend a dog that half this town thinks ought to be put down." She thrust the papers toward him. "I went home and I sat in my kitchen and I thought about Maggie, about what she would say if she saw me sitting on my hands while her husband made a fool of himself in front of a judge." David took the papers, His hands trembled. He couldn't read them in the dim light of the porch. 43 signatures. Eleanor's chin lifted. "I went to every house on this street, then the next street, then the one after that. I told them what I saw through your window, that dog shaking in the corner, scared of his own shadow. I told them about the man who spent 40 years saving their pets and never charged extra when they couldn't scrape together the fee." Her voice cracked like old wood. "I told them about Maggie, about how she would have wanted us to do right by you." David stared at the papers, the names blurred together through the water in his eyes. "Ellie, I said don't talk." She wiped her face with the back of her hand, rain or tears. David couldn't tell. "This doesn't fix anything. A petition isn't evidence, but maybe—" She stopped, took a breath. "Maybe it shows you're not alone, even when it feels like the whole world's turned its back." She turned and walked down the steps into the rain. "Eleanor." She paused, didn't turn around. "Thank you." Her shoulders moved, a small nod, then she was gone, swallowed by the darkness and the storm. David stood in the doorway, holding 43 names in his shaking hands, and felt something stir in his chest, something that had gone cold and quiet 18 months ago. The courtroom was fuller the next morning. David noticed it the moment he walked through the door. Faces he recognized. Eleanor in the front row. Spine straight as a fence post, hands clasped in her lap. Tom Miller beside her. Ruth Patterson. The Peterson family, minus the 3-year-old this time. 20 people, maybe more, sitting in the gallery, watching, waiting. The judge entered. Same gray hair, same reading glasses, same unreadable expression. She looked at the expanded audience with raised eyebrows but said nothing. "This hearing will reconvene to address new evidence in the matter of—" The door at the back of the room opened. Nathan walked in. Alone. He wore a white dress shirt that didn't quite fit too tight across the shoulders. Collar stiff and unworn. His hair was combed flat against his head, still damp from the morning rain. His face was pale as milk, but his jaw was set hard. He walked down the center aisle, past the gallery, past Eleanor and Tom and Ruth. He stopped in front of the judge's bench. "I want to testify." Hale's attorney shot to his feet. "Objection. This witness was not disclosed. He has no guardian present. He's a minor child. I'm 12 years old." Nathan's voice was thin, but it didn't waver. "I was old enough to call the police. I reckon I'm old enough to tell the truth." The judge studied him. Her pen tapped against her notepad. "Where are your parents?" "Young man, my dad doesn't know I'm here." Nathan swallowed. "He told me not to come, but I couldn't." His voice broke. He steadied it. "I couldn't let them take that dog back. Not after everything." Silence. The judge looked at Hale's attorney, at David, at the boy standing alone in the center of the courtroom, small and scared and impossibly brave. "I'll allow it." She held up a hand as the attorney started to protest. "Briefly, the witness may make a statement." Nathan turned to face the room. His hands hung at his sides, fingers clenching and unclenching like he didn't know what to do with them. "I was there," he said, "at the barn, for almost 2 years. Every time my dad worked nights, I snuck out and went to that place. I saw the cages. I saw what that man did to those dogs." His voice grew stronger with each word. "Number 7 Shadow. He wasn't mean. He wasn't vicious. He never fought for food, not once. He waited until the other dogs ate first, every single time. And when Mr. Hale came in with that stick," Nathan's throat worked. "Shadow would get in the way. He'd put himself between the man and the smaller dogs. That's why he has so many scars, because he took the beating so they didn't have to." Tears ran down his face. He didn't wipe them away. "That dog isn't dangerous. He's the bravest thing I ever saw in my whole life. And I was too scared to help him. For 2 years, I was too scared to do anything but bring scraps." His voice cracked wide open. "But I'm not scared anymore. And I won't let them send him back to the dark." The courtroom was silent. Eleanor had her hand pressed over her mouth. Tom Miller was staring at his shoes, jaw tight. David looked at the boy 12 years old, standing alone, defying his father, defying the court, defying everything, and felt the last frozen piece of something in his chest crack loose and fall away. The judge removed her glasses, cleaned them slowly on her robe, put them back on. "Is there anything else you wish to add?" Nathan shook his head. He walked back down the aisle, past the gallery, and sat in an empty seat at the end of a row, alone. But sitting tall, the judge shuffled papers on her desk. "I've received an update from the county prosecutor's office this morning." Her voice was flat, businesslike, giving nothing away. "Victor Hale has been formally charged with 16 counts of aggravated animal cruelty. The evidence collected includes photographs, veterinary examination reports, and testimony from multiple witnesses." Hale's attorney went pale as curdled milk. "Under state law, all animals connected to the case are to be permanently seized and placed with approved caretakers. Mr. Hale has no legal claim to any of the animals in question." She looked at David. "The German shepherd known as Shadow will remain in your custody. This hearing is concluded." The gavel came down. David sat motionless. The words echoed in his head, but they didn't feel real, couldn't be real. Then Nathan was beside him. Then Eleanor, her hand gripping his shoulder hard enough to hurt. Then others, Tom, Ruth, faces he knew, and faces he'd forgotten. He knew voices washing over him like warm water. "You did it," Eleanor said, her eyes bright and wet. "You stubborn old fool! You actually did it!" David shook his head. His voice came out rough as gravel. "Not me." He looked at Nathan. "Him. The boy's face went red. He shrugged, tried to look away. "I just told the truth. That's all." "Son, that's the hardest thing there is." Outside the courthouse, the rain had stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds, weak but warm, turning the wet pavement into a mirror of gold. David stood on the steps, surrounded by people who had shown up when it mattered, and felt something shift inside him, something that had been broken for a very long time. His hands were still shaking. They would always shake now. But for the first time in months, that didn't seem to matter quite so much. 1 year later, October, the maple tree in the front yard had turned gold and copper. Leaves drifted down in the morning breeze, settling on the porch steps, the walkway, the hood of David's old Ford. David sat in his rocking chair, coffee cup cradled in both hands. The tremor was worse now, always worse in the mornings, but he'd learned to work around it. 2 hands for the cup, slow movements, patience. Shadow lay in the patch of sunlight that fell across the porch boards. His coat gleamed healthy now, filled out, the matted clumps long gone. His eyes were closed, his breathing slow and deep. No trembling, not anymore. The Zenith radio on the porch railing played low. Patsy Cline singing about falling to pieces. Margaret used to hum along to this one while she tended her roses. Off-key, always off-key. And David had loved every wrong note. He looked at the rocking chair beside him, Margaret's chair. The dust was gone now. Nathan sat there on Saturdays, drinking lemonade, tossing a tennis ball for Shadow in the yard. The boy had grown 3 inches since the trial. His father still hadn't apologized, probably never would, but he drove Nathan over every Saturday afternoon and waited in the truck while the boy played with the dog. Small mercies, that's what Margaret would have called them. Eleanor came by on Wednesdays with apple pie, still warm from her oven, covered with a checkered cloth. She didn't come inside anymore, still too nervous with Shadow around, but she'd started waving at him through the screen door, last week. She'd said his name out loud. "Morning. Shadow." 2 words. They'd meant more than she knew. Victor Hale was in prison now. 18 months for animal cruelty. Another 2 years tacked on for tax evasion the investigators had found while digging through his records. The barn had been torn down. The land sold to a young couple from Columbus who were building something new. David set down his coffee cup, looked at his hands, still shaking, always shaking. The neurologist said it would get worse. More pills, more appointments, more slow erosion of the man he used to be. But these hands could still do some things. They could stroke the fur of a dog who'd learned to trust again. They could hold a cup of coffee on a quiet morning. They could wave to neighbors who stopped to chat at the fence. They could rest on the arm of Margaret's chair and remember. "Hey, Maggie." David's voice was soft, meant for no one but the morning air. "I reckon I'm going to be all right. Took me a while to figure it out, but, yeah, I think I'm okay." Shadow's ear twitched. One eye opened, regarded David with something like curiosity, then closed again. His tail thumped against the porch boards, one slow wag. Then another. The Methodist church bells began their Sunday call, drifting across the rooftops from 3 blocks away. David listened. Didn't move to get up. Didn't need to. Shadow stretched, back legs first, then front, the way dogs do when they're content and unhurried. He walked over to David's chair and laid his head on David's knee. Heavy, warm, alive. David's hand trembling, always trembling, came to rest on the dog's head. His fingers found the torn ear, traced the old scars, settled into the familiar rhythm of touch. "You know what, boy?" His voice was rough but steady. "Turns out getting old ain't so bad, long as you got someone sitting with you." Shadow didn't understand the words, but he understood the voice, the gentleness in it, the peace. His eyes drifted closed. His breathing slowed. The sun climbed higher. The shadows shortened. Somewhere down the street, children laughed on their way to Sunday school. The smell of Eleanor's apple pie lingered faintly from yesterday, mixing with fallen leaves and coffee and the particular warmth of October mornings. David rocked slowly in his chair. The wood creaked beneath him, familiar sounds, comfortable sounds. And for the first time in 3 years, Shadow slept in the light without dreaming of darkness. If something in this story sat heavy with you, that's all right. Some feelings don't need names. They just need a place to rest for a while. Many of us know what it means to sit in a quiet house and wonder if anyone remembers we're still here. Some of us have loved something broken and found ourselves mended in the loving. Perhaps you've carried something for a long time, a loss, a worry, a hope you stopped talking about and never found the right moment to set it down. We don't always get the answers we were looking for. We don't always get to say goodbye the way we wanted. Some things stay unfinished, and that's just how it is. The story doesn't need to wrap up neat and tidy. It's allowed to breathe. It's allowed to linger. You stayed until the end, and that means something. Not everyone does. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. Thank you for letting these words keep you company. Even if just for a little while.